So, good morning to my students for the second time and to my friends and colleagues. Thank you for your heroic presence here.
No. Heroic.
So you see, the title is about the architect and his double. I will tell you the story of two brilliant architects who were very close friends and shared the same visions, even if they had different approaches to architecture. It is, to me, a fundamental theme because I personally need to understand, to better understand how the architecture is produced. It's quite mysterious. And I don't think that it's so useful if we really want better understand to look at histories of architecture, because the main topic for historians is to demonstrate that there is a strong relationship between one architect and the other one, and in many cases, almost in all cases, historians shows a sort of evolution. Starting from one point, the work of an architect is going to another point, and it is automatically supposed that the starting point is not so good as the final one. But maybe history is different, and for sure, human life is different. So, that is the question. What architects are dealing with when designing? This beautiful drawing by Heinrich Tessenow shows an architect working alone. And you know that it is not true, because we more and more share our experiences with other person, colleagues, and collaborators. But I think that in the very creative act, the architect is alone, apparently alone, because he has to deal with many things. For instance, the city. It is not possible to understand the work and the masterpieces of some architects without taking into account the physical architectural space where they used to live. So now the story is about two Swedish architects, quite well known, even if, as usual, it is not easy to find their works in the classical history of modern architecture. They were born in the same year, and they had a parallel curriculum, if you want. They met in 1910 and 11 in a school, a special school, which was called Clara Schola. It was a private school, and the young architects asked to all the masters to give classes in this school. And they asked Westman, Östberg, Boom, Bergsten, the main actors of the so-called national romanticism, to teach in their private school. And in this occasion, they became a friend. And the day after finishing, the year after finishing the school, they decided to begin their own professional activity. In 1915, they decided to participate in the international competition for the South Cemetery in Stockholm together. And it will be the end of the story. So we have seen the city. It is impossible to understand what they were looking for without taking into account the city. The city of Stockholm is fascinating, a very particular city built on several islands located where fresh water coming from the interior of the country and the seawater merge together. The city, like you see it here, it is a city that they used to know, because this picture is dating back of, the end of 19th century. The very center of the city and the development, the extension, realized according to the urban plan designed by Albert Lindhagen, which is actually the actual form of the city of Stockholm. It is important to underline the fact that for both, it was absolutely necessary to respect this urban plan, even using different architectural languages and forms. Now, just to give you an idea of what the city of Stockholm looked like at the beginning of 20th century, I will show you a series of strange photographs. In reality, they are called autochrome. It was a special process in order to obtain the first color photographs in the world, patented by the brother Lumière, and there was this engineer called Gustav Cronquist, who was the first and the only one to own an autochrome machine. And he was an engineer, but very fond of architecture, chemical engineer, and so he used to work in a industry producing concrete. He was very fond of his city and of architecture in general terms. The pictures are fantastic because this process produces color images with a quality which is quite the same of watercolors. And you see the traces of time on these pictures. I like them very much, but beyond the pictorial qualities, they are a very efficient way for seeing, for understanding what the city was at that time. So Cronquist decided to deal with the different aspects of the city, the historical city, new housing neighborhood, but also engineering construction, and he wanted also to celebrate the modernity of the city, taking these night pictures showing advertisement. You see, we are at the half of the 20th. Another important point of the city is dominated by the town hall. The town hall is the masterpiece of Ragnar Östberg, the best representative of national romanticism, or romantic nationalism, I don't know, and in fact one of the architects that the young ones asked called to teach in this private school. From an historical point of view, the photographs by Cronquist are really meaningful and precious, because you can observe here, for instance, the end of the construction of this amazing building that you see here, dominating with his tower the water where fresh and sea and salt water merge together. The building is very complex, a building, but dominated by the idea of an urban space. So a sequence of garden, monumental porticos, courtyard, and here there is a covered courtyard, a Lichthof, which is really fascinating. It is an exterior space which in reality, an exterior which is in reality covered it is quite magic, and naturally it was not possible for young architects not to take into account these amazing, very rich expression of an architectural culture which is not only belonging to Stockholm. The idea of Östberg in this case was to represent and to show all the richness of Swedish culture in architecture. Here you see that from the portico you can get a garden, and from this portico you have a look to the historical center of the city. And here another picture showing the garden. The garden is a flat surface practically at the same level of the water surface. It's the same relationship between water and earth that you can find in Venice. And in fact, this building is very deeply linked with Venice, with the Doge Palace, and even in the tourist guides, you often read that Stockholm is like a Venice in the north. And I think that Östberg contributed in a very important way to this definition, which was physical and also ideal. Another set of autochrome by Cronquist illustrates the very center of the modern city, dominated by commercial buildings, and not far from the building we have seen before, by another amazing building, which is the concert hall, built by Ivar Tengboom, another architect who used to teach in the Clara Schola. It's a magic building, a very simple, naked box, and on the facade giving onto the marketplace this powerful colonnade. But the most amazing point is the interior. Tengboom, describing his work, said, "I wanted to reproduce the fascination of a southern piazza, under the sky, an open-air space." So it is an illusion. And this search for illusionistic architecture was very important also for the younger generation. Here you see a photograph of the same space represented in the perspective, which is not retouched, and which shows in a very clear way that through a very complicated system for getting natural light, one had the illusion to be in an open space. The building is blue, with this set of columns which represent quite an archaeological fragment. But in the same period in Stockholm, it was also possible to find a neighborhood like this one. So naturally, the first topic our two architects used to deal with was housing. And so the story begins now from the moment when they decided to run their separated, autonomous professional activity. And you see here a series of projects realized by Sigurd Labyrinth in association with Torsten Stubelius, and they are, if you want, theoretical projects. No one of these was actually realized, but they are very important because they show very clearly that the young generation was looking for a direct relationship between the traditional rural house and a new way of building housing units. And it is a very rich catalog of different typological approaches, going from a very simple house to this one, which is quite a fantasy. In parallel, Asplund got a commission for designing a housing building for the workers of an industrial plant. Unfortunately, once again, this building was never realized, but in spite of the simplicity of the building itself, it is very rich. First of all, from a typological point of view, the distribution system is very smart and original, and the final result, when we look at the facade, is this. Very simple building, clear volume, but if you look at the facades carefully, you will discover that there is some strange topics. For instance, if you look at the main facade, the number of windows of the upper floor is different from the lower. And if you know a little bit about Gunnar Asplund, you could eventually recognize in this figure something that Asplund will realize some years later, the famous Villa Snellman with this ambiguous double entrance door. So, from here to the Villa Snellman, we could also say that architects used to deal with their own work. And it is particularly true when we take into account these two architects, because I have the impression that they used to accumulate experiences, and any single project has traces of the previous ones. In the same period, Asplund got a real commission for building a workers' neighborhood in the southern part of the city, which was unfortunately destroyed some 40 years ago. Very good from the point of view of the typology assemblage, and quite meaningful from the point of view of the architectural language. You can easily recognize here the typical way of building wooden houses belonging to Swedish tradition, but also the appearance of some classical elements. In parallel, Labyrinth developed this project. It is the same kind of commission. Once again, unfortunately, never realized, with a 3 entrance door. And another project not built by him. And it is quite obvious to imagine that the two guys used to discuss their project, to show them, to show each other what I'm doing now. Look, I'm fighting against this difficult distribution, and you, what are you doing? And it is real life. I'm showing you many projects never published. If you look at monographies on Labyrinth, you never find this, and also Asplund. So this was the very beginning of their professional career. Now, let's make a small jump to 1924, because this is, if I'm not wrong, another example of a never published project by Labyrinth, which is really fantastic. The problem was to realize a building for 4 families having 2 identical facades. That the reason of this diagonal organization of staircases, and it is quite obvious that they were dealing with the same problem. how to get the maximum interior quality, dealing with elementary, pure volumes. Next step. At a certain point of his life, Gunnar Asplund will be the director of the national architectural magazine, which is called Architectura. And in 1918, he decided to publish 3 houses, and I consider that this issue of the Review Architecture can be considered a sort of manifesto of the new Swedish architecture, dealing with very small buildings. There was an image here. We will get it later. So the first one is a villa by Labyrinth and Stubelius. The second one is the house and atelier for a sculptor who collaborated in the decoration of the town hall, and the project is by Ragnar Östberg. And the third one is the famous Villa Snellman. We have already seen the double entrance doors. This is the pages of the review. Now, let's have a look to the 3 buildings. They have quite exactly the same dimension, and they are completely different. For the first time, for a private villa, Labyrinth and Stubelius proposed a volumetric complexification. So the typical rural house in Sweden is composed by a single volume. With this act, they introduced the possibility of defining, from an architectural point of view, also the exterior space. And Asplund is doing the same game, is playing the same game. Östberg, from his side, is doing a volumetric combination with small secondary volumes linked to the main ones. And here you see pictures of these buildings, which is now a public museum. You can visit it, and in the interior there is a lot of sculptures by Karl Ende. This is the Villa Axner by Labyrinth Stubelius, and it is very important to understand how they try to get the best views, the best orientation. Look at the position of this portico, and once again the courtyard, which is an architectural element belonging to the building itself. And finally, the Villa Snellman. Now let's have a look to the very dimensional aspects. The same, exactly the same. And we can also imagine that fighting in a certain way, the one against the other one. Asplund was trying to demonstrate that using a narrower building, he was able to produce a distribution, because the Villa Axner has no distribution. It is based on the classical enfilade. I think that in the real life of architects, it is completely normal to imagine that, yes, I'm doing 8 meter 50. I will try to do a little bit less. Now, I think that the Villa Snellman has to be developed a little bit more. What architects are dealing with when designing, it is clear that designing the Villa Snellman, Asplund used to think of his Mediterranean travel, where he had the possibility of exploring not so much the monumental Renaissance architecture. No, he was looking for popular architecture. And one day, not far from Rome, he had lunch in an open-air restaurant, and in front there was this rural but quite classical house. And it is not difficult to imagine that this building was somewhere in his head when he designed the Villa Snellman. First version is a huge villa in masonry. Even if Sweden didn't take part in World War I, the economic situation was not so brilliant, even for a bank director like Mr. Snellman used to be. And so this pergola or belvedere was cancelled, and mainly it was decided to use a more economic construction system, and the villa was built in wood. And this is a final plan showing the ground floor, and here you have the upper floor. I told you that one common topic was to get the highest possible spatial complexity within very pure and elementary volumes. So look at the plan. Look at the distribution element, this corridor, which is deformed according to a perspective effect. The presence of this characteristic element, which is called upper living room, very good organization of the plan with a distribution element. And this corridor is quite astonishing. Here you see the end of the staircase coming from ground floor, the upper living room, and it's not possible. I don't know why. There is a photograph of the corridor. I don't know why, because only in Pamplona, Anyway, imagine here a photograph of this accelerated perspective produced by the geometric deformation. And look at this project by Labyrinth, 3 years before, a huge villa, the Villa Bank. And have a look at the bottom floor. You see? It is the cellar, the caves, and Labyrinth proposes exactly the same deformation. But it is really funny because for him, it was a pragmatical way in order to produce stockage spaces without obstruing the passage. And for Asplund, this practical solution became the very central point of the Villa Snellman. But the Villa Snellman has other strange points. This facade, for instance. When I used to show it to my student, I keep this slide 3-4 seconds, and then I ask them, what have you seen? A facade. In reality, now look carefully. You see that the windows are shift, and they are describing non-regular lines in vertical sense. Here you see this semicircular window. It is corresponding to the upper living room, which is higher than the other rooms. And we remember that in this unbuilt project, for typological and distributional reasons, the windows were shifted. So, I repeat, an architect deals with himself. I had the occasion of looking the original drawings, and you probably know that in this time computer didn't exist. And so architects used to draw by hand their projects. And when it was necessary to change something, we used to use a blade, a shaving blade, to cancel Gillette or to cancel the ink lines. So now, if you, it's not so clear, but you see that there is shadows beside the windows, which indicates that at the very first step, Asplund wanted to emphasize the shifting of the windows. So in the final version, these two windows are perfectly aligned. Here you have 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters. So he was looking at the way for moving things without producing a perturbation of the general vision of this facade. You see, there it is possible to see. Now I have reworked this drawing, and I have put the windows where they were supposed to be according to the first version. And you see, probably it was too much. Asplund was dealing with the search for all the possibility of manipulating architectural elements without disturbing the general harmony, we could say. In fact, there is no functional reason. It was a joke. It was a way of using Villa Snellman like a one-to-one model for future projects. And why it was so easy? Because in spite of its aspect, the building is a wooden building. Don't forget the issue of the magazine Architecture showing 3 similar buildings from a dimensional point of view, from a functional point of view, even if one of them was an atelier with a small living unit, and this one. It is wood covered by plaster. It is not obvious, and it could be a good starting point for reflecting about the truth in architecture. And I think that Asplund is very conscious of the fact that architecture is an artifact. Architecture could be a simulation. There is no single column by Palladio, for instance, which is in stone. Another typical topic at that time was funerary architecture, because Sweden adopted a new law concerning the construction of a lot of new cemeteries. And you probably know this very famous building. We will come back to it. Is a small chapel realized by Asplund in the Woodland Cemetery, 1920, and look at what Labyrinth built 4 years later, dealing with the same geometry, the same formal approach. I have my personal opinion, but it is not so important to decide if, in this case, Asplund was better than Labyrinth or vice versa. I'm just trying to tell you the story of two young men working about the same ideas. Labyrinth, the importance and precision of geometry and the huge impact of this volume dominated by the pitched roof. I'm really sorry, but it's the wind, the Pamplona wind. So new cemeteries, but also the two guys got the commission from rich families to build the family monument in another cemetery, the North Cemetery, an old one. And now you can still find these two chapels. Retting by Asplund and Malmström by Labyrinth. They were looking for the very origin of architecture. An architecture which was supposed to be timeless, dealing exclusively with the roots of tectonic. And they were in competition, in my opinion, once again, because everyone wanted to be the most originary, the closest to the very origin of architecture. This is a contemporary photograph, but look at a photo of the St. Chapels in the 30s or 40s. Oh no, this is not possible because it is too important. I don't know what to do. But I'm sorry. Anyway, the next picture shows the two chapels, but the one by Labyrinth is higher, and it has 3 steps on the front facade. It was dismounted and remounted because, according to Labyrinth, it was too complicated to enter the coffin. Because of the 3 steps, it's not a real reason, because a coffin enters, I don't know, every 20 years, I don't know. But anyway, he dismounted the chapel in order to become more radical. And at the end, it is another lost, I don't know. We have already seen that they decided to participate in the competition for the Southern Cemetery together. And this is one very famous image of this extraordinary work in architecture and in landscape architecture. They were friends, but at a certain point they began to have some personal problems, and so at a certain point, for the realization of the cemetery, they decided that Asplund would be responsible for the buildings and Labyrinth for the landscape. And the two things, anyway, work perfectly together. So this is probably much more Labyrinth than Asplund. And this is the final part of the cemetery, the big crematorium by Asplund, finished in 1940. So we are dealing with a project started in 1915, so with a duration of 25 years. And this is also a particular aspect of some of the projects by Asplund and Labyrinth. This is also a very famous building. By the way, the Southern Cemetery of Stockholm is human heritage recognized by UNESCO. And when you enter this wonderful park, you practically don't see the crematorium. You see only a few pillars supporting the entrance portico. And describing the crematorium in the Architecture magazine, Asplund said, the most important point was to celebrate the mythical landscape. It is quite fantastic because it's not so common to see architects renouncing to celebrate themselves and their buildings. So you enter and you get a landscape. The buildings are quite invisible. This is the competition entry. It was completely different in relationship to other projects because they decided to deal with the Nordic forest. The forest is dominating this huge perimeter. And naturally, the project had many versions. It was modified. And what you see here is the final version, the entrance. This black dot is the cross, the stone cross that you have seen, the crematorium, and here you see the first chapel realized by Asplund. Because they got the commission, they won the competition, they got the commission, they were asked to produce new plans, and at a certain point it was time to begin to build. And the first program was a small chapel. And they decided that Asplund would build the first one and Labyrinth the second one. And once again, in my opinion, is a friendly competition. I underline, dealing with the same ideas but using completely different architectural forms and languages and approaches. But during many, many years, they used to answer to particular questions by the authority for cemeteries. And I want to show you a fantastic project by Labyrinth, which was supposed to represent the entrance gate to the cemetery. The first chapel, the chapel in the forest by Asplund. So just, you see, tack,
Yes.
tack. It's fantastic. I have controlled. The stones are exactly the same. It was dismounted.
Labyrinth is the first one. Labyrinth.
Yes, this one. And you see, it considered at a certain point that probably it was too much. In order to get the very elementary, original form of architecture, back. And even if you look at some architectural details, you see that it was not possible to avoid a certain kind of decoration, but here it is really quite invisible. We have lost another, yes, I was telling about a project never built by Labyrinth for the entrance gate to the cemetery. A classical temple, and a small building which is inside and outside at the same time. Do you know what this building was supposed to be? Telephone cabin. It is ironic and very serious at the same time, and it is really a pity that this building wasn't actually realized. Yeah?
Picture of the corridor.
Ah, giusto, you're right. So the landing of the staircase and the perspective. So you see, at the very beginning there is nothing, and then shelves and cupboards, and at the end the depth of this geometrical variation contains a staircase. The staircase going up. So, the first chapel by Asplund. We approach. There is this gate. Probably he was still dealing with this research of the minimum and most powerful possible architectural form. And the chapel is quite invisible. Describing the project in the review, Architectura, Asplund said the most important point for a small chapel is to be submitted to the forest. So the problem is to make this building disappear, because the main idea was the celebration of the Nordic pine trees forest. The first act was to define a perimeter, like a sacred place where the chapel occupies a central position, but there is also other objects. This Likbod is the place where the coffin are stocked before the celebration, and then there is a fountain, an open-air religious space, and this is the main gate. You enter the precinct. We approach. Diagonal view. In order to build this chapel, Asplund sacrificed the minimum amount of existing trees. And in fact, you see that there is a central pathwalk to get the entrance, and there is a tree practically in the middle of the path. The idea was to celebrate the forest. And now we are in the portico before the small chapel, and you see how architecture and nature merge together. If you look at the chapel from far away, you have the impression that the columns are like the trunks of trees, and vice versa. And it is, in a certain way, also an explication of a problem which was quite important, a theoretical project quite important at the time, how to get the very origin of architecture. And according to Laugier, the very origin of architecture is yes, a hat obtained by trunks, tree trunks. The language is vernacular, even if the columns of the portico have a quite invisible capital, you see, but the dominating element is this huge, dark roof. So the approach is vernacular. No modification in the forest, and the way for getting the very center of the composition is a continuous line. From the gate, from the entrance gate, you walk straight on and you find the door, and in this promenade, the dominating element is the darkness of the forest. And what a surprise when you enter the chapel, when you get this small space, because it is full of life, full of light. The central space is covered by a dome, getting natural light from above in a quite mysterious way. And so the contrast and the real experience of this chapel is very intense, because it is a sort of opposition between nature, the darkness, and the light. And we could also discuss about the symbolic meanings of such a building. It is a building for funerals. According to their discussion, the second chapel had to be realized by Labyrinth. And the second chapel is completely different. The starting point is this hill, come si dice, la collina delle rimembranze, the remembering place, della memoria, ecco, the hill of memory. And starting from this point, there was a long pathwalk, rectilinear pathwalk, conducing to the chapel. And look how Labyrinth realized this pathwalk. It is a break within the density of the forest, a blade of light defining the pathwalk. We approach. And we begin to see something which doesn't belong to nature, which is an architecture. And when we arrive in front of this chapel, we see a classical architecture. Classical architecture is the first impression, because if you look carefully, you see that yes, it is classical, but not, I would say, in an academic way. The other guy decided to build using a vernacular vocabulary, if you want. Labyrinth, a classical one. You approach and you understand that the building has something strange. This is the entrance portico, and this is the chapel. The plan is very clear. You remember the small chapel by Asplund, linear access, and at the end, a space dominated by natural light. Here, after walking more than 1 kilometer or 100 meters, I don't know, straight on, you get the chapel and you have to turn. You have to break your walking. Once again, from a symbolic point of view, it's a fantastic way for describing what death is. The interruption, violent interruption of human life. The inside of the chapel is dark. There is only one point from which the space gets its light, is a monumental window, but the very impression you have when you enter is that you need a few seconds or minutes in order to recognize that the surface is decorated by quite invisible, very thin classical pillars. And we are talking about two buildings. They don't touch each other. Once again, from a symbolic point of view, a fantastic way for describing what the building is supposed to represent, to illustrate, to evoke. And this is the exit door. Let's come back to the plan, because the symbolic content is really fundamental. Tac, interaction, celebration, and then we go out this way. If the funeral ceremony take place in the afternoon, when the exit doors open, you see the sun in your eyes, in front of you. So you can understand the allusion to resurrection, to a new life. It's really very well done, and it is important. But it is clear, also from a very architectural point of view, this chapel is the most complex and rich small building that I ever seen. So they are completely different, dealing with the nature, with the forest, with the movement, with the time, with the symbolics. And once again, I don't pretend to say if whether the first one is better or the second one. I just want to remember to you that if you approach to this topic only looking at monographies on Asplund or monographies on Labyrinth, you lose the very central point of their human life as architects. And comparing these two chapels, you have a real vision of what modern architecture in Sweden was able to produce at the beginning of the 20s. And the celebration of the mythical landscape. Some urban projects. The first one is a competition, a very important competition for the city of Göteborg, the second most important city in Sweden. And here you see the place where the competition was about. And I will show you now very quickly several entries. The program was a culture forum, so theater, museum, two theaters in reality, and many different cultural facilities, if you want. So you see here typical projects, very, very 19th century, if you want. It is clear, look at this, theater, theater, museum. Theater, theater, museum. And so it was important, the competition, many architects took part in it. And now look at the proposals by Asplund and Labyrinth. Fragmentation. Asplund, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 buildings. Without taking into account this lower part, participants were free to propose or not something for this part. And look at the Labyrinth. An explosion. The site is sloping down from the higher part towards the city, and Asplund places in the top area, the museum. Labyrinth proposes really an explosion, a way for celebrating the natural landscape within the city. Asplund, very strongly influenced by his travel to Italy, dealing with normal architecture, quite domestic architecture. And it is important to see that this fragmentation gives him the possibility of making the new piazza very permeable. One, two, three passages connecting the new culture forum with the rest of the city. And now, Labyrinth. Look at this sketch and look at his obsession for vertical, very narrow frames, like we have seen in the cemetery. Once again, an architect, when designing, deals with himself. And for Labyrinth, it is a real obsession. And it is quite strange. There is no so many architects dealing with this very particular way of framing the landscape, natural or urban landscape. This is the strongest image. So, an explosion of buildings presenting a very strange geometry and celebrating the nature of this small hill. Labyrinth participated in a group which was commissioned to realize the building, because the first prize was apparently not extremely convincing, and so you will find Ture Rydberg, the winner, Ragnar Jordan, and Labyrinth, and it is not impossible to recognize what Labyrinth was working on. And look at the plan. Look at this building. It's broken by this obsessional vertical frame. Unfortunately, they realized another project. Once again, this project was never published, and it is really fantastic. Urban projects, another competition. Gunnar Asplund participates with Ture Rydberg to the competition for the Royal Chancellery. It was a very important project because it was in the very center of the city, quite in front of the Royal Palace. The idea was quite unique. The Royal Chancellery, what is? It is an administrative building. You see, office, corridor. But the idea for Asplund was to make this complex very open and very public. And in fact, it is possible to walk in this piazza and to go down to the courtyard, arriving to the water. And the facade giving onto the water is, according to a majority of critics, un capriccio italiano. Because he was young, he was in Italy. No. It's much more complex than this. Because this facade is facing to the town hall. This Venetian dream, architecturally and ideally a dream. So Asplund wanted to respond to the main building of his master, speaking Venice. Stockholm as Venice in the north. It's very complex, but it is not the topic of my lecture, so I just show you this competition entry because 1 year later, Labyrinth dealing with a similar program, used the same organization. Urban projects, you remember I have shown to you a neighborhood for workers built by Asplund in the southern part of the city. Here we have some typological combination, as usually very smart, very well working, using the minimum space and the simplest construction. But what is really astonishing is the general plan, anticipating in a certain way the functional or rationalistic way of composing housing neighborhood, deforming itself according to the nature. Behind this long bar there is a huge rock, and proposing a set of spaces which go from a very public to collective to a village-like piazza, giving this neighborhood a very strong identity and illustrating the typical hesitation by Asplund between regular figure and their deformation. But there is always good reasons for this. So very old photographs, because as I told you, the building doesn't exist anymore. And then the first chapter of my story is the famous Stockholm exhibition, 1930. Asplund was the responsible for the architecture of the whole exhibition. It was huge, directly facing the water, and you see many pavilions, and here a small village composed by small houses. The three topics of the exhibition were housing, transportation, and daily life objects, oggetti quotidiani. So Labyrinth participated in the exhibition at two levels. The first one, he was responsible of the posters, the advertisement of the manifestation. Very good work. The second participation was in the section devoted to housing. And so he designed many interiors, and what a visitor could visit, explore in this occasion was modern forms of housing, or small buildings for cooperative association, a kind of organization which was growing in that time in Sweden. And here, the second part, transportation. Once again, we have, thanks to Cronquist, wonderful pictures. So you see, the idea is a walk along the waterside and many pavilions following the path, and proposing very different forms, very often using naval techniques, like for this music pavilion. And Asplund demonstrated to be able to do also very modern architecture. And in fact, if you read books about the history of architecture in Sweden, 1930 is considered the point where modern classicism stops and the new story, functional architecture, funkis in Sweden, begins. This is a famous advertisement tower. One of the restaurants. the entrance gates, the central piazza, a night view, fireworks, and naturally it was a very important event, and many people visited it, and among them also architects. And one architect moved from Finland to visit it, the young Alvaralto, who used to admire Asplund. And when he went back to Finland, he wrote about this exhibition on the Finnish Journal of Architecture. Once again, Asplund got it. He realized a composition made of houses, flags, lights, flowers, fireworks, happy people, and clean tablecloth. I find this concern by an architect perfect, because it is true that we have already seen Asplund had this incredible capacity of putting architecture in a background. He always tries to celebrate something else, which is not architecture. Architecture is a tool for celebrating life, or death, or nature, a forest, or a sky. The exhibition had an enormous success, and you can see it here. This was a new concern. The year after the exhibition, Gunnar Asplund, with a group of younger architects, wrote a book which is a sort of manifesto of the new architecture, Acceptera, which means more or less you will accept it. It is a very strange book because in a certain way it is a typical propaganda book of modern times, but the very beginning is dealing with a social question. You see, Individen och Massen, how to combine individuals within a mass society. It is a new look to architecture, to society. Here is a picture of the author of these books taken in the exhibition. And here we have the last photographs by Gustav Cronquist showing a machine, a building machine, which is considered the very beginning of modernity in Sweden. And if I'm not wrong, in the next days you will have a lecture by Clua Ucedo on this building. So it is an anticipation. Modernity begins officially now. I think that it is possible to say that it begins many years before. The conclusion of my story is a little bit dramatic. June 21st, 1940, the official inauguration of the crematorium with the king, the mayor of Stockholm. You see, it was quite an important occasion. A few months ago, Asplund ashes were buried in the cemetery. Sigurd Labyrinth died 35 years later. A new life with the production of beautiful buildings that everybody appreciates. Thank you very much.